on those, on analysis number 3, so that you've got plenty of time to read through my feedback before you start that one. Oh, I know the other thing was the next piece of work for the class is coming up. So start to have a look at that. It's the Olympic constraints. I think I remember to open that file. If you can't find it, throw me an email to remind me. But start looking at the guidelines for that, so that if you have questions on what to do, we can tackle those early next week and clear up any confusion for you, okay? That's going to be Olympic constraints. So it's an assignment, it's just, I think you'll enjoy it. You get to pick a piece of video from the Olympics and talk about the constraints that are at play. You know, we've spent all semester talking about our constraints triangle and how those interact to affect the movement pattern that we can observe, right? So I think you'll enjoy that activity because you get to play around with some video for that one. Okay, I'm going to get started. Hopefully a few more people will jump in. Now, I made the decision, I'm umming and ahhing about whether it was the correct decision, to skip chapter 13. Chapter 13 is on the link, well, it talks a lot about sensory information, what that is, how we receive it, how we learn certain perceptions about objects. It's a really fascinating chapter. There's too much good stuff in this book to get it all done in one semester. So I skipped that one. I'm jumping straight into perception action, but I would recommend that you at least go back and flick through chapter 13 and maybe read the summary notes and the little pieces in the margins on the edges of the page, just to get an idea of that information, because it is really cool. But as I said, I can't get everything into a semester. All right, so we're going to start on chapter 14 and look at some cool data. So, perception is a learned experience that your brain puts together with experience. All right? The definition of perception or the explanation of perception is that it's a process that's going on subconsciously in the brain, typically, and the brain is selecting information to pay attention to because it's getting bombarded with information all the time. Can't pay attention to every piece of information it's receiving. So part of perception is selecting which bits of information it's going to pay attention to, organizing that information, and then integrating it into a sensible picture, and then, as we'll see now, then deciding what's my response to that going to be. Okay? So for a long time, developmental researchers in a couple of different fields have felt that movement is very important to the development of these perceptions. And perceptions are highly individual, all right? So we don't all perceive a moment in time or a color or an activity in the same way, right? Our perceptions are personal to us based on our experiences and the way our brain has developed, okay? So the developmental systems are interrelated. So we've talked about that idea a lot, that we have, you know, various systems in the body that are developing, and they develop at their own rate. All the systems don't develop at the same time, and these systems are interrelated. Okay? So what we believe is that our movement, our physical activity is distinctly necessary to couple, to link together the idea of perception in the brain and the movement that comes from that perception, okay? And then, of course, once we move, our perception changes and we get more information to continue moving with, right? So we have what we call a perception-action loop that occurs. So even if you look at early childhood education literature, it doesn't have to be motor development literature. If you look at the education literature, many of the early researchers in childhood education also agreed that perceptual motor activities were an important idea to incorporate. So putting these two things together, right? You may have heard of an author called Piaget, a researcher called Piaget. He's a big name in early childhood research, along with Vygotsky, and there's a couple of others, and off the top of my head I can't remember them. It's a long time since I took an education class. Piaget believed that a child's reality is constructed by connecting, by coupling, linking together this idea of the action with the sensory information that the brain receives. All right, and so they move through stages. We see a developmental sequence of that action coupling with sensation. All right, and in infancy, the link is not very well organized, that it takes practice, all right? So we're not born with the idea of 3 dimensions, for example, right? Our retina in our eye is a flat, well, it's slightly curved, but it's basically a flat surface at the back of the eye. The retina receives the visual information and sends that on to the visual cortex. Okay, so what the brain receives is actually a picture that is 2-dimensional. So the fact that we understand 3-dimension is a learned experience, right? The fact that I know that there's space behind the desk when I'm standing here and I can't see space behind the desk is because I understand that the desk is a 3-dimensional object, and I understand that it doesn't go on forever in that shape, right? So this is not, as I said, we're not born with this idea. We have to learn this. And so a lot of the behaviors that we see in young children are geared for the brain to be learning about space, shape, okay? So direction, all right, handedness, yeah, all kinds of perceptions that children are learning, all right? That there's a behind something as well as an in front of something that they can see, right? So that in front of something becomes obvious once they get the idea that this object is closer to them than this object. So they have to learn that first. But then they also have to learn that this object still exists when it's behind the other object. Does that make sense? All right, so, you know, things that we take for granted as adults, we weren't born with, we have to learn. So that can be a very fascinating experience to watch kids learning some of that information. Okay, and now, more and more, especially in the last 15, 20 years, the equipment to look at what is happening in the brain has become highly sophisticated. And so now we can literally look at what the brain is doing, which areas of the brain are working at what times, which areas of the brain are talking to each other during which activities, okay? So we're learning heaps right now. The brain development literature is just exploding at the moment. It's really a fascinating area of study. So we know that motor and cognitive development are joined together, that they interact, right? And one of the things that we've learned from the physiology world is that when we exercise or when we are physically active, that we see increased levels of brain proteins called BDNF. BDNF stands for, if you're interested, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is way too many words. So it's easier to remember BDNF and then type that into Google and ask it what it means, you know. So those proteins are responsible for stimulating the growth of nerve cells in the brain and protecting against the loss of synaptic connections, the wiring, and things like that. Also, we see that growth hormone factors are increased along with BDNF. So we also see greater capillary growth in the brain. So if I've got more capillaries in the brain, that means I'm getting more oxygen and more food to the brain cells. Okay? So we know this from physiology research, right? They can identify these proteins and they exercise someone and then they measure the level of proteins and these go up. We also see that certain areas of the brain do more than one job. So the cerebellum, for example, where's my notes here? The cerebellum will play a role in my posture and in complex skills, but the cerebellum is also linked to language, emotion, memories, right? So things are happening in the same area that suggest this connection is quite strong, right? Does that make sense? So a meta-analysis is a fancy term for a type of literature review, a specific type of literature review. And so a relatively recent literature review showed that there was a positive relationship between physical activity and cognitive functioning. All right? So this then, for me, this becomes really frustrating because we know know this information. We know this. We know there is a link between physical activity and cognitive function. And yet, what we're seeing happening in the school systems all over the country is we're shrinking the amount of time kids get for recess, and in some places we're removing PE and physical activity altogether, right? Which makes no sense, because when they move, they are able to work better in the classroom, right? So, and we've seen evidence of this from preschool up to high school, right? So it's not like it's connected just to one age group. This is across the board, okay? Now, the link, as far as I know at the moment, is short term, right? It's not like if I'm physically active, ergo I'm smarter, right? That doesn't happen. What happens is, if I'm physically active, then I'm able to sit in the classroom and learn better, right? Pay better attention, absorb more material. There's quite a lot of interest in which way round should we do that? Should we do the physical activity first before the math class? Or do we do the math class first and then do the physical activity where their brains can be processing that math information, right? So I don't think we've fully answered that question. I would say do both, but you know, I'm a bit extreme in my views. But yeah, do both. The more we move, the more we can pay attention, right? So Piaget felt that reality had to be constructed on experience. So it was a little bit like the education version of information processing, right? I put a motor program in place, I do the movement, I receive feedback, I tweak the motor program, right? When we look at an ecological approach from our constraints theory and our perception-action approach, we would say that it doesn't have to be constructed because I can experience reality. Right? So if you watch an infant, it's quite obvious that the infant is able to process certain sensory information before it can move itself, right? So no one argues the fact that the perception, the sensory information, and the processing of that sensory information comes first, okay? But once we're able to self-locomote, right, now I can change my perception and learn more information about my environment. And the more information I learn, the more curious I become, and so the more motivation there is to self-locomote, right? So it becomes this loop. So for example, it's a bit of a silly example, and it's difficult when you're an adult to really take it seriously. Just bear with me and give it a try, right? If I stand here, when you come back in the fall, you can come and try this out. If I stand here in this classroom, in room 16, at the end of the whiteboard that's at the back of the classroom, I can't see a corridor outside, right? So if I didn't know, if I wasn't able to abstract that idea that there is a corridor out there, then I would think that this room was like a box, okay? My perception of this room is a box. But once I can self-locomote, I can locomote my body down this way, and through the window in the door, now I can see there's somewhere else outside my box. Right? So I can learn more about my environment, but I had to move in order to get that information. Okay? So we have this loop that begins that's tightly tied together. Right? And it's very, very hard to do research on this idea, because in order to do research, you would have to deprive a population of moving, right, in order to see how the two populations developed. And that's not, as you'll see, with regards to humans, that isn't an acceptable thing to do, right? It's a little bit different when we get to the animals, though. Okay. So, new actions make new information, right? That information stimulates more movement, because now I know there's a corridor out there, now I want to go and look in the corridor, right? Because humans are innately curious. I can't just sit here and go, oh, look at that, there's a room out there. Anybody ever read the book Room? If you didn't, I highly recommend it. As a developmentalist, it's a fascinating read. It's a story, I mean it's a novel, but it's a really fascinating idea from a developmental point of view. So I would highly recommend that for your summer reading. Okay, so what we want you guys to start thinking about, because you're the ones who are going to go out into the world, work with populations, children, adults, and have the opportunity to impact what's going on out there, right? If the continued brain research confirms our belief, right, that physical activity not only facilitates brain activity, but positively facilitates actual learning, right? Then what are the implications going to be for how the school day is set up, right? What about classroom activity, okay? So maybe we don't have enough time in the day to send the kids out onto the playground every day, but as an educated teacher, I can incorporate movement and physical activity concepts within my classroom, either as what they call an activity break, right? So we have a couple of options. We can just be in the middle of a math class and the teacher goes, okay, pens down, everybody stand up, let's march around the room for 2 minutes. And then we sit down again, right? Or your other option is to build movement and activity into the learning process, right? So if I'm doing a geography lesson and I have a map on the wall, give me a beanbag and tell me to throw the ball at a particular city, right? So then I can incorporate throwing practice and geography practice at the same time, okay? But it's going to be you going out there and making these changes, right? So, I said it was a little bit different for the animals than it is for humans. This is quite an old experiment now. but people are bringing it up because it's such a key concept. And they used kittens here. Cat brains are remarkably similar in many ways to human brains. Their eyes in particular have similar cones and rods to us, so that from a laboratory point of view, they're quite interesting to use, apparently. So, as I said, this is quite old. It's as old as me. I was born in 1963. So, but the relevance of it to us is becoming more and more real. Right? So what they did, they took these two kittens and they constructed a merry-go-round that was within a kind of a drum, right? And the merry-go-round had on one side a harness, so they put one kitten into the harness, and on the other side it had a little carry-cot, and one kitten got to ride in the carry-cot. Right? So the kitten in the harness was tempted to walk round and round and round and round and round on the merry-go-round. Okay? The kitten in the carry-cot got to go round and round and round and round, sitting in its little cot, watching all this. Right? So one kitten had visual stimulation and physical stimulation, movement, and one kitten had visual stimulation without any of the movement, without any of the locomotor experience. Okay? What they found was that when they finished the experiment, so they did this, you know, over days and weeks as the kittens got older. All right? What they found at the end of the timeline was that the kitten that had been sitting in the carry-cot had two problems. The first problem was that obviously their motor skill development was delayed because they hadn't had any practice, right? They'd been sitting still for all this time. Okay? The other thing that they found was that the kitten that had been sitting still had delayed depth perception capabilities. Right? So not only were the motor skills impacted, but the brain's ability to judge depth was, even though it was getting that visual information, was also affected compared to the kitten that was doing the walking. Right? So it's a really cool experiment, very interesting information. So in the 80s, a group of researchers, and I believe they were over in California, Campos has or had a lab over in California. I can't remember which university he was at. And so what they wanted to look at was if that kitten that was walking had better perceptual understanding of its environment, what happens if we look at humans, at babies, right? So we can't deprive one baby of moving. So what they looked at was looking at children who had not developed self-locomotion yet, but had access to one of those baby walkers. Right? Have you seen those? They're like a little ring with a sling seat in it and wheels on it, and you sit the baby in and their feet can touch the floor and then they can push themselves around. Right? So we give them the ability to self-locomote before they can do it for themselves. right? So they're pre-walkers, but they can self-locomote. Okay? And then they looked at a drop-off experiment called the visual cliff. And they looked at the idea that it was the link between the locomotion experience that taught the brain depth perception. Okay? So what they found was that it was the locomotor experience, how long had the child been locomoting, was much more relevant than the age of the infant when they put them on the visual cliff. And I've got to find my visual cliff. Where is my link? Hold on, I'll have to go into YouTube and try and find this piece of film for you. I can't find my link there.
Only pay for what you need with Liberty Mutual. I just said that.
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad will bond. This
everyone has had some kind of an experience feeling something kind of like fear of heights. And it makes perfect common sense that we shouldn't jump over the edge of a drop-off because it's dangerous. And if it's dangerous, then we should probably be afraid of it.
Probably. Exactly how and when this hypothetical fear develops makes for pretty gleeful research inside Dr. Perry-Nadolf's lab.
We're discovering some surprising things that are flying in the face of, how people have studied locomotion for the last 100 years.
Including what babies do and feel when they're on a ledge.
So the story about fear of heights is that there was a very, very famous classical study in developmental psychology by Gibson and Locke in 1960 that showed that human infants and infants of a number of different species will avoid crossing over an apparent drop-off on what they call a visual cliff.
Soon as the baby move about and be observed in the same way, so that happens.
It's a glass table, and on one side there's a checkerboard pattern surface right under the glass. The other side of the table, the pattern surface is way down on the floor. So visually, it looks like a big 3-foot drop-off. So when human babies first begin crawling, most of them will crawl over the apparent drop-off, but after several weeks of crawling experience, then they'll begin to refuse to crawl over the drop-off. And the conventional interpretation of this was that infants are avoiding the drop-off because they're afraid of heights.
Backing away. She's not interested. She wants no part of that stuff.
The experiment became the shaky foundation for the myth that crawling innately teaches us to fear heights.
Babies avoid going over the drop-off because they're afraid of heights. How do we know they're afraid of heights? Because they avoid crawling over the drop-off. So as you may have noticed, the argument is circular.
As it happened, the visual cliff was a better test of an infant's depth perception, not their fear of heights. And if you look closely, you may have actually noticed that the babies don't look particularly scared.
It is a perfectly safe surface of support. So after one trial, human infants cleverly figure this out, and then they will crawl over the drop-off.
So how do you really test if a baby's scared of heights?
You can test babies
Okay.
into a real
Uh-oh.
no safety glass. It's just an actual drop-off. The drop-off can be adjustable.
So, what they're finding, or what they found, was that at 8 months, or whenever the baby starts to creep on its own, if you take that new creeper immediately, so within the week that they start creeping, and you put them on that visual cliff table, they'll go straight over to mum on the other side of the table. After 3 weeks of creeping around the house, if you take them back and you put them on that visual cliff table, they'll go to the edge of the cliff and they'll go, whoa! And they won't go any further. So that's not because they're afraid of falling, it's because now their brain goes, wow, okay, that's like a long way down there. I don't know how to manage that, right? So it's very cool. It's very, very interesting to watch what happens with that. Where did I get to? We were here, right? So the more locomotor experience the infant gets, the more their understanding of spatial relationships develops, all right? And so what Campos and his team found was that if we give the infant experience with self-locomotion by cheating and putting them in a baby walker, they develop these spatial relationships quicker than the children that were still waiting to locomote on their own. Okay, so it's quite an interesting concept because baby walkers more recently have a bad rap because quite a lot of babies got injured in baby walkers, right? Because they would locomote around the house and then they'd go down the stairs and they'd fall down the stairs, right? Well, and so the baby walker got blamed because if the child had been on its blanket, unable to self-locomote, then it wouldn't have fallen down the stairs and hit its head and got a big bruise on its head, right? But it wasn't the baby walker's fault. How come the person that was in charge of the baby let the baby get that close to a set of stairs in a baby walker, right? So baby walkers have a bad rap, and you don't see them anywhere near as much as you did back in the 80s, right? But it isn't the baby walker that should be getting a bad rap, in my opinion, right? It wasn't the walker that did the problem. Ooh, I have a typo. God, I hate it when I see typos. So some other experiments that were going on in the 80s that give us some information about this development is that one study they were looking at the barrier, right? So they would put an opaque barrier up in front of mum, for example, and they'd let the baby creep over towards mum, but it couldn't get to mum because of this barrier. And so again, what they found was when they were first self-locomoting, they would get to the barrier and stop and just look up at mum and get upset because they couldn't get to mum, right? After some experience with locomotion, they would creep across to the barrier, look at mum, look at the barrier, and creep to the edge of the barrier, and then realize they could go around the barrier to get to mum. Right? So they're learning that there's a backside, right? That this is three-dimensional space. Does that make sense? And Gibson and the team of researchers, and if you continue watching that clip on YouTube, you'll see some more examples of this, that they also found that the amount of experience the individual had at locomoting, the more they learn about slopes, how steep a slope is. Again, it's connected with depth perception, but also the surface of of something. So is the surface squishy, right? If it's squishy and I've just started walking, hey, I'm going back down on my hands and knees because this doesn't feel good, right? With the slopes, they'll find that they'll put the baby, and if the slope is quite soft, then the baby will just keep creeping down the slope, right? If the slope becomes steep, the baby goes, whoa, okay, I'm going down backwards, right? And what's interesting is that if you take a creeper with experience, so remember that they're going to start creeping somewhere around 8 to 9 months, right? And they don't walk until 12 months. So by the time they're ready to walk, they've had a lot of experience at locomotion on their hands and knees. Okay? And so what's interesting is that a child who is faced with a steep slope on their hands and knees will turn around and go down backwards when they stand up to start to walk. They're like, oh, now what do I do? And until they're experienced, they try to step down the slope. It's the experience that counts with the perception of the environment. Questions?
No.
No? Okay. So affordances, if I'm not getting all my classes muddled up, which I may be, so yell at me if I'm wrong about this. I believe we talked about affordances quite a long time ago, earlier in the book. Remember that the affordance is the opportunity the environment gives me to move, right? So what the ecological researchers believe is that the affordance that the environment is giving is perceived directly by the individual, right? And that what affordances I perceive are going to be based upon my abilities and my experience. Okay? So a good example that they talk about in the textbook is looking at a flight of stairs. So before I go into that example, I'm going to relate it to something I see a lot when I fly, right? So often I'll fly through Dallas, and when you fly in from London to Dallas, you get dropped off at a gate that is lower down, and so you have to go up to the concourse, okay? So when you come out of the walkway off the plane, you're faced with 3 options. So it's really an interesting social experiment, I suppose, for me. I just love to watch how people respond to things, right? So I've got an option of an elevator. I have an option of a, what do you call a escalator?
An escalator.
You call them escalators? Okay, so I've got an option of an escalator, and I've got an option of a regular flight of stairs. Alright? So, I get off the plane, right? We've been sitting on the plane for 10 hours. I'm looking at these 3 options and I'm going, God, I'm going up the stairs because I can't wait to move my legs, right? And get the blood flowing. But it's really interesting to watch how many people come from being sedentary for 10 hours to continue being sedentary faced with that flight of stairs. Because the majority of people get on the escalator. The people that use the elevator tend to be the elderly or someone who's got an injury of some kind, right? Will use the elevator. But it's really interesting to see how few people go up the stairs, right? So, stairs then give affordance for climbing, so they afford climbing. So if you watch an infant or a toddler faced with a set of stairs, right, then the behavior is going to be very different to if you are faced with a set of stairs. Okay? So when you walk up a flight of stairs, what is your motor pattern like? Describe your motor pattern as you walk up a flight of stairs. Anyone? Who's in there? Pick one.
There's Ibn, Adriana, Colson, Glory, Graceland, Isaiah, Maddie, and Wilson.
Pick one.
Colson.
Colson.
I'm here.
Okay, you're up, my friend. Describe your motor pattern when you climb a flight of stairs.
What motor pattern would it be?
Yeah, describe it. What would you do? What does it look like?
To climb upstairs, like if you're like climbing up the stairs?
If you're walking up a flight of stairs, what does it look like for you? Given you're not injured, right?
Yeah, I would pick up my right leg and I'd move my left arm back and move my left arm up and move my left leg up with my left arm like in sequence basically. And
Okay.
keep doing that until I get to the top of the stairs.
Okay. Do you put both feet on the same stair?
No, I skip a step.
Okay, good. Well done. So when you look at a healthy adult walking up a flight of stairs, the motor pattern we see is alternate stepping up the steps, right? Everybody agree with that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so when I look at a toddler going up a flight of stairs, I'm going to see something quite different, okay? Initially, I may see them, or an infant, I may see them creep on their hands and knees, or their hands and feet, all right? Once they're able to maintain their postural control, then the next stage that we typically see is that they're going to go up 1 foot at a time, right? So they're going to take a step and they're going to bring their other foot up. They're going to take a step, they're going to bring their other foot up. They may well be hanging on to a handrail or to someone's hand, right? But even once they've got enough balance to do it on their own, they do not alternate step. They step and join, step and join, right? Interestingly, right, if you go to the other end of the lifespan and you watch an elderly person go up the stairs, particularly if they have not stayed physically active and don't have strong legs, They go step and join, step and join, right? Not my dad, okay, who's 85, because he trains in the gym every day and he works hard on maintaining his leg strength as best he can, given that he's in a phase of his life where his leg strength is floating away from him, however hard he works, right? My dad will walk upstairs a bit slower than he used to. He's a little more careful about it, but he goes up alternate stepping. But a lot of elderly people will go up holding onto the handrail 1 foot at a time, okay? So we see this change in observable movement pattern based on changes in constraints. One of the interesting constraints that they found is that the affordance for climbing the stairs is related to the relationship between the height of the step and the individual's leg length, right? So in adults, what they find is that ratio is somewhere around 88%. So if I took you, Colson, and I give you a flight of stairs where the relation between your leg length and the step height was 50%, right? You'd walk up normally. But if I give you a box, right? Boxes, and the height of the box is around 88% of the length of your leg, you're not going to alternate step anymore. That's what they think. The research hasn't been done so far that indicates a ratio like we had with, remember we had that ratio with the hand size to the size of the object that we were picking up, and it depended on the ratio as to whether I would reach with one hand or two hands. We haven't found one model like that that holds true across different age groups. But it's still an interesting idea that whether I go up step, step, step depends upon how deep the step is. Okay? What would the depth of the step, what kind of constraint would that be? Come on. You've only got 3 to choose from.
Can you say it again, Dr. Law?
What is the stair height? What kind of constraint on that triangle? So it's not individual, right? Because it's nothing to do with the person.
Would it be environmental?
Yes, there you go. Well done. Good. It wasn't a trick question. Excellent. Okay, so another way we can look at the link between sensory information and my understanding of that sensory information and the actions, the movements that I do, is by looking at tool use. And again, there's quite a lot of work on this done with infants and looking at the development of these ideas. So young infants will use a lot of trial and error, exploring they'll use that haptic perception that we talked about, understanding the characteristics of the object. One of the reasons that being able to sit unassisted is an important milestone is because that frees up the hands to start doing this explorative work, right? And so gradually children will start to relate objects and surfaces to each other, okay? And we talked about the kinds of toys that we can provide to help them learn some of these spatial ideas and shape ideas, right? So one of the ecological concepts, this idea of affordance, says that the affordance gives a relationship between objects, right? So there's some difference, and we don't need to go into too much detail at this level, but there's a difference in the idea of affordance, of perceiving the opportunity given by the object in an ecological perspective versus previous ideas in early childhood literature on how cognitive ability advances. All right? So our reaching, grasping is an opportunity for perceptual learning. Right? Tool use helps with perceptual development. They can learn these haptic ideas. They can learn that the square block goes in the square hole, but the triangular block won't go in the square hole. Okay? So on the playground, you know, I'll use colors and shapes and spatial ideas. Do you want to go over the bar? Do you want to go under the bar? Right? So that they can start to learn these ideas. Now, body scale becomes important, right? So the size of the object I'm working with in relation to me, right? And so the body scale is this relationship, this relativity between me and the thing, okay? Body scales obviously change from infancy, certainly up into early adulthood, and then they start to change again in older adulthood. We get a little bit shorter, we get a lot weaker, right? So we have to think in our field, it's really important to start to incorporate this idea of body scaling, right? If I body scale PE equipment, sports equipment, physical activity equipment, and I am willing to scale down the environment, so like the size of the playing field, for example, then that allows different individuals to engage and be successful in the activity that I'm providing, right? So you might have heard, depends how interested you are in tennis probably, but the USTA a few years ago started a new program that's geared towards trying to get more young children in America playing tennis. Okay? And it's somewhat driven by American culture and the idea that, you know, we've got to be number one, we've got to be winning, and other than the Williams sisters, American tennis has been having, particularly the males, have been having some trouble lately holding their own with the rest of the world. And so they wanted, you know, and as everybody, it's kind of an obvious concept that the more people I have at the bottom of the pyramid, the more chance I'm going to have someone at the top of the pyramid, right? So the idea is to get many, many more young kids in America playing tennis, because historically tennis has been expensive, white, right, middle upper class. They're the people that can afford to play tennis, okay? Rackets are expensive, and all this kind of thing. You know, yes, you can go to the local recreation park, and there might be a tennis court there, but it's probably got grass growing through it, and the net is all ragged and broken, and the lines are a bit faded, right? It's not exactly an Olympic training ground, right? So that's the idea, is to try to provide more opportunity for children in the States to play tennis across multiple communities and multiple socioeconomic levels, right? And they've also, by doing this program, they've created a version of tennis that is developmentally appropriate for these children, right? So they have scaled down the size of the racket, they've changed the ball, they've shortened and narrowed the court, they've lowered the net, and now these kids can play tennis and learn some really quite spectacular skills. And then as they get older, if they want to keep playing, then these skills transfer to bigger tennis rackets, harder balls, bigger courts, right? I don't have time, but think about this question when you're going through these notes, right? If you walk through an elementary school and it's empty, right? How would you know which was the kindergarten classroom? Right? So just be thinking about that in relation to body scaling, okay? Let me show you a quick example of this tennis game. That one I can find. Uh-oh, have you not been watching any? Did I forget to link that? Have they not been able to see?
I don't know.
Okay, here we go. So the program's called NetGen. And you can see here, this picture, the ball is larger, right? The racket is much smaller. It's a pretty effective looking backhand though, right? Okay. Trying to think if there's a bit of film here. Yes. What I want is a picture of the actual. That gives you some ideas. So in the same way that we have to provide developmentally appropriate spaces and equipment for younger children or novice players, you know, even as an adult, I kind of like the idea of having some flexibility with the rules of tennis, right? What challenges do we provide, you know, what do we do when a child is challenged with a disability or an individual is challenged with a disability? And again, you guys have to chime in to shut me up, but because my enjoyment is to watch tennis, then, for example, wheelchair tennis is played at the Olympics, it's played at all the major tournaments. But the rules for wheelchair tennis are that the ball can bounce twice rather than just once, right? So that gives someone who's trying to wheel across the opportunity to get to the ball, okay? So we have to be flexible, we have to be creative, we've got to be willing to play with our constraints, right? With the task and the environment so that we can provide an opportunity for someone to be successful at a game or an activity, right? All my examples are tennis, but whatever sport you play, you should be able to come up with similar kinds of examples. Okay. So we're discussing that movement facilitates perceptual development, that perception comes first, and that motivates the development of self-locomotion. And then when I move, I learn new information about the environment, right? So depriving people of movement can put that individual at risk of delay, right, in their perceptual development. And one population that they saw this in was when Eastern Europe opened up, their NGOs and Red Cross and people like that moved in to help support the communities, found that children that had been in orphanages during that time often had delayed motor skills, delayed social skills, delayed language skills, delayed perceptual skills, because even at the age of 6, 7, 8, they were finding them in cots, right? So in a baby's cot, which doesn't give a 7-year-old enough room, you know, to move around, because that not through the orphanage being unkind, but because they just didn't have enough resources to keep these children safe if they were out running around. You know, they were short on teachers and staff. The only way they could keep the kids safe was by keeping them in a cot for most of the day. So these children had quite severe delays in several domains. Right? The more movement experience we've got, way back in lab, we talked about the fact that at up until about the age of 10, the brain is overwiring itself, right? It's making thousands of synaptic connections between different cells in the brain. And the more movement experience that we have, the more of those wiring, those talking capabilities within the brain survive. think we'll start there on Tuesday. And I think on Tuesday, I'm meant to be finishing chapter 14 and starting chapter 15. But there's still quite a lot of chapter 14 to go. So I may not get very far into chapter 15. I might have to see if I can maybe reduce a few slides here so that we can stay on track. So we'll start with postural control and balance on Tuesday. Any questions about any of the information so far in chapter 14? It's really an interesting, chapter 13 is fascinating, chapter 14 is fascinating. The whole book's fascinating really for me. But yeah, these ideas of how do I take this theoretical information and put it into an applied situation where it's useful for me, right? So that's kind of the key. So looking at some of these ideas makes it real, I think. Questions, comments, an experience to share.
No, ma'am.
No! You have to go out to the park and just watch the kids play and see. What do I see there? Sorry?
I said I like playing tennis.
Oh, good. Is that Wilson?
Yes, ma'am. It's supposed to be in shape. I mean, I don't get some pounds.
I like playing it, I just am not very good at actually hitting the ball. But yeah, you've got like all the top players in the world in Miami at the moment playing the Open. So
Yeah.
I don't know how expensive the tickets are though to go and see it.
I would assume it would be expensive.
I would think so. But probably worthwhile. There have been some pretty close matches so far. Okay, so oh, we don't want that. Try to do some reading, all right, so that you can answer questions, so that you're a little more confident with taking a chance at answering something. Keep up with reading the information, and because there's obviously a lot more information in the chapter than I'm able to cover in the lecture. All right, so dig in to that information and get a better understanding of that for us to move on Tuesday. Okay, have a lovely day. Enjoy the
Thank you, guys.
sunshine.
Thank you.